Part 1. Jam Master Jay. He was introduced to the world as the calm center of a loud revolution. Jam Master Jay was never framed as a threat. He was framed as proof. Proof that hip-hop could grow up, clean up, and still conquer the world. While others were portrayed as wild or reckless, Jay was marketed as discipline and structure. The men behind the turntables who helped take rap from neighborhood block parties into global living rooms. When rock and rap collided and crossed into the mainstream, his hands were on the controls. To an entire generation, he represented balance. Talent without chaos. Fame without scandal. Publicly, his image was reinforced with care. He spoke against drugs. He opened doors for younger artists. He invested in his community in Queens. He was described as a mentor, a guide, a man who stayed grounded while others lost themselves. Parents trusted him. Schools invited him. Media outlets pointed to him as the example of what success in hip-hop was supposed to look like. He was not just famous. He was safe. That perception hardened over time, becoming a shield so strong that few ever questioned what might exist behind it. The night he died shattered that shield. He was not in a club. He was not on a street corner. He was inside his own recording studio. A private space. Familiar walls. A couch. A video game controller in his hands. No visible danger. No visible fear. The setting mattered because it created the illusion that nothing bad could happen there. No heavy security. No locked-down perimeter. He believed he was home. The danger did not come from outside the culture. It walked in through the door. The men who entered were not strangers. One had known him since childhood. Another was tied to him through family bonds. They were buzzed into the building. They climbed the stairs calmly. There was no negotiation. No argument that spiraled out of control. The moment was direct and deliberate. A weapon was raised. A single close-range shot ended his life instantly. The room that had been built for creation became a place of final silence. In the aftermath, shock took over the industry. Fans refused to believe there was any internal logic to the crime. Media coverage framed the death as senseless. Random. Another tragic loss to violence that made no sense. The dominant narrative painted him as a purely innocent victim caught in chaos he never invited. That version of events was comforting. It protected his legacy. It allowed people to grieve without asking hard questions. Years passed without resolution. The case stalled. Witnesses did not speak. Leads dried up. The street code of silence did what it always does. It preserved secrets by trading truth for survival. Each year that passed strengthened the myth. The longer the case remained unresolved, the easier it became to freeze him in time as a flawless symbol. The idea that something darker could exist underneath was quietly dismissed. That changed when federal court proceedings finally pulled the story apart piece by piece. Testimony introduced a version of Jay that the public had never been asked to confront. By the early years of the new century, his financial reality had shifted. The group that once dominated charts no longer generated the same income. Obligations did not disappear with declining popularity. Taxes accumulated. Expenses remained. Pressure mounted. The lifestyle expected of a legend demanded money that was no longer flowing freely. According to evidence presented under oath, he made a decision that contradicted the image he had spent years promoting. He did not become a street-level dealer. He did not stand on corners. He used connections, travel access, and trust. He acted as a middleman in a large-scale cocaine operation. The quantities discussed were not symbolic. They represented serious money. The kind of money that could erase debt and restore control. The risk was enormous, but so was the reward. The operation did not collapse because of law enforcement. It collapsed because of betrayal. A partner who expected to profit from the deal was suddenly cut out. In corporate language, it would be called a business decision. In the underground economy, it was a declaration of war. Removing someone from a transaction of that scale was not just about money. It was about respect. Power. Survival. Anger hardened into intent. The people who killed him were not driven by jealousy of fame. They were driven by the belief that he had violated an unwritten code. In that world, reputation is currency. Being excluded is humiliation. Humiliation demands response. The execution was not impulsive. It was calculated. Planned. The setting was chosen because it guaranteed access. Familiarity became the weapon. When the verdicts finally arrived decades later, they forced a reckoning that many fans had avoided. Two versions of the same man existed side by side. One was the pioneer who helped reshape music history. The other was a man under financial pressure who crossed a line he once publicly condemned. Neither version erased the other. They collided. This collision created discomfort. It challenged the idea that role models must be simple. It questioned whether legacy should be judged by art alone or by the totality of choices. Some saw him as a victim of an industry that celebrates youth and abandons its architects. Others saw a cautionary tale about believing one can move between worlds without consequence. The court did not judge his music. It judged the actions surrounding his death. But public memory is not bound by verdicts. It is shaped by emotion. He did not die because he was famous. He did not die because of lyrics or rivalries. He died because he entered a trade governed by rules that do not bend for reputation or history. The studio that once symbolized safety became proof that proximity does not equal protection. In that environment, trust is temporary and loyalty dissolves when money is involved. His story leaves no clean ending. It leaves tension, admiration and disappointment in the same breath. A man who helped elevate a culture also became trapped by the pressures that culture refuses to talk about openly. The silence that protected him in life ultimately protected the truth about his death for years. What his story represents depends on where the listener stands, and that question alone reveals why this case still divides audiences today. And as this investigation moves forward, the next story reveals a death without a weapon, without a struggle, and without warning, where a single transaction ended a life in silence. Part 2. Mac Miller. Mac Miller was never sold as untouchable. His appeal came from the opposite place. He sounded human. He spoke plainly about anxiety, sadness, exhaustion, and the slow grind of addiction without trying to glamorize it. His music felt like a diary left open on a kitchen table. Fans did not see a myth. They saw themselves. A young artist who admitted he was struggling and kept working anyway. That honesty built trust, and trust shaped how the world understood his life and his death. By the final months of his life, he was publicly framed as someone trying to regain control. New music. Studio focus. Plans forming. People around him described cautious optimism. Not a miracle recovery. Not a fantasy ending. Just movement in the right direction. Addiction does not disappear when things improve. It waits. Quiet. Patient. It speaks in small, reasonable requests. Rest. Sleep. Silence. The last exchange that mattered did not involve threats or raised voices. It happened through text messages. Casual language. Familiar shorthand. A request for painkillers. Not framed as excess. Not framed as celebration. Framed as maintenance. Something to take the edge off. Something to get through the night. Something to sleep. In a market flooded with pills, that request sounded ordinary. That is what made it lethal. What arrived was not what was promised. The pills looked correct. The color. The shape. The markings. Everything designed to signal safety. They were not produced by a pharmaceutical company. They were pressed by hand in an uncontrolled environment. Inside them was not the expected substance. Inside them was fentanyl. A synthetic opioid far more powerful than what the buyer believed he was taking. The difference was invisible. The risk was absolute. There was no dramatic confrontation. No chase. No argument. The exchange was quick and quiet. Trust changed hands with the product. When he took the pills, he believed he understood the dose. He believed he knew the effect. He did not know he had been handed something that could shut down breathing in minutes. There was no margin for error. There was no second chance. When he was found unresponsive, the first reaction followed a familiar script. Headlines leaned on a single word. Overdose. A term that implies excess. A term that quietly places responsibility on the user. But toxicology reports complicated that story. The levels of fentanyl in his system were not consistent with someone knowingly ingesting it. They were consistent with someone being deceived. That distinction changed everything. Federal investigators did not treat the case as an unfortunate accident. They treated it as a crime built on misrepresentation. Phones were examined. Messages were traced. A digital trail exposed the structure behind the sale. Not a lone dealer acting in isolation. A chain. One person sourcing counterfeit pills. Another moving them. Another delivering them. Each step separated just enough to dilute responsibility while preserving profit. The investigation revealed awareness. Messages showed that the people involved knew the pills were dangerous. They discussed potency. They discussed risk. They did not warn the buyer. They did not slow down distribution. The transaction was treated like any other delivery. Fast. Casual. Disposable. A life reduced to a line item. Sentences followed. Prison time was handed down. The court made a clear statement. Selling fentanyl disguised as something else was not viewed as simple dealing. It was viewed as an act that knowingly put a life in immediate danger. The punishment reflected that shift. The justice system rarely moves quickly or decisively when addiction is involved. In this case, it did. What remains difficult is how language shapes memory. Calling it an overdose suggests failure. Calling it poisoning suggests betrayal. One frames the story as personal weakness. The other frames it as violence without a weapon. The difference matters because it changes how society assigns blame and how future cases are understood. His death exposed a modern reality. Street drugs are no longer just impure. They are unpredictable. Chemistry has replaced hierarchy. The buyer no longer knows what they are taking, even when they believe they do. Familiarity no longer offers protection. Trust no longer reduces risk. The danger is built into the system. His music now carries an added weight. Songs about swimming, balance, and staying afloat read differently when the end is known. He was not chasing a high. He was chasing quiet. He was not reckless in that moment. He was tired. That truth unsettles people because it removes the comfort of distance. It suggests that the line between survival and silence can be crossed without spectacle. This case forces listeners to decide how they define responsibility in an era where deception is standard practice and lethality is accidental only in name. And as this story closes, the next chapter turns to a young lyricist whose life was ended not by his own actions, but by the unresolved war surrounding someone he loved. Part 3. Big L. Big L was not climbing slowly. He was about to step through a door that only opens once. In Harlem, his name already carried weight. In studios across New York, his verses were treated as proof of something rare. Precision. Fearlessness. Control. He was known for turning street language into sharp structure, for delivering lines that could stand next to the best without apology. At the moment his life ended, he was not struggling for relevance. He was standing on the edge of a contract that could have lifted him out of the neighborhood permanently. He had done what the city teaches its brightest kids to do. Focus on craft. Stay disciplined. Build a future with words instead of weapons. He showed up to sessions. He refined his sound. He stayed visible but not reckless. To the industry, he was an investment about to pay off. To Harlem, he was a local hero who made it without forgetting where he came from. What he could not rewrite was blood. While he was sharpening lyrics, his older brother was deeply embedded in the drug economy of the same streets. Not a rumor. Not a minor role. A known figure with active conflicts. In that world, disputes do not fade. They pause. Prison does not erase grudges. It preserves them. While one brother worked toward contracts and tours, the other accumulated enemies who measured time differently. By the late winter of that year, those enemies were not interested in negotiation. They wanted repayment. They wanted consequence. The problem was access. The intended target was locked away, protected by concrete and bars. The solution followed a logic as old as street conflict itself. If the person you want is unreachable, you go after what they love. You send a message that travels farther than words ever could. The night it happened was ordinary. He was in familiar territory. A block he knew. Faces he had seen his entire life. There was no sense of imminent danger. No reason to hide. That comfort became the opening. Shots rang out suddenly. Close range. Repeated. Targeted at the face and chest. The intent was not warning. It was finality. When his body hit the pavement, the future everyone had been waiting on disappeared with it. Panic followed. Sirens. Crowds. Silence. The brutality of the attack made one thing clear immediately. This was not random. This was not mistaken identity. This was not about music. The precision spoke louder than any statement. Someone wanted him gone in a way that would be understood. Investigators moved quickly at first. Names surfaced. One in particular stood out. A man who had grown up with him. Appeared in photos. Shared history. Shared space. But that same man was also tied to the drug conflict surrounding his brother. Two paths intersecting in the worst possible way. Friendship on one side. Street obligation on the other. In neighborhoods like Harlem, those forces do not coexist peacefully. An arrest followed. Hope flickered briefly. But hope requires voices. Witnesses looked away. Statements changed. Fear settled into the room like fog. People knew what had happened. They also knew the cost of saying it out loud. The case unraveled not because the truth was unclear, but because survival demanded silence. Charges were dropped. The streets returned to routine. The killer walked free. No courtroom resolution. No official closure. Just an empty space where a career should have been growing. Years passed. His name was spoken with reverence and frustration in equal measure. Everyone agreed on his talent. No one could agree on justice. What makes his death cut deeper is what he was not. He was not part of the drug trade. He did not profit from it. He did not enforce it. He was collateral. A substitute. A body chosen to satisfy a debt he never owed. In that sense, his story is one of the clearest examples of inherited consequence. Punishment without participation. The city has a long history of celebrating escape stories. Music as the exit. Talent as the key. His death challenges that belief. It suggests that proximity can be just as dangerous as involvement. That you can do everything right and still be pulled under by someone else's choices. That legacy is fragile when violence treats families as single units instead of individuals. His catalog became frozen in time. No evolution. No late career reflection. Just raw potential preserved in recordings and memory. Fans argue about what he would have become. Industry insiders speak in hypotheticals. None of it changes the fact that his life ended on a sidewalk because someone else needed to make a point. Years later, the man widely believed to be responsible was killed as well. Not by a court. Not by a sentence. By the same cycle that took the rapper before him. Another body. Another unsolved scene. Another confirmation that the street settles accounts on its own schedule. The symmetry offered no comfort. It did not bring him back. It only reinforced the rule that violence rarely delivers closure. His story forces an uncomfortable recognition. Escape is not individual when history is shared. Success does not erase old maps. The streets remember bloodlines even when the industry sees only talent. He paid a price for loyalty he never chose and conflicts he never entered. Whether he should have left sooner or stayed rooted remains an open question that still divides listeners. And as this story ends, the next chapter follows a rising star whose past refused to stay buried and returned at full speed when success made him visible. Part 4. Chinks. Chinks did not invent a new story. He survived an old one and tried to rewrite the ending. His early life moved through the machinery of the street economy. Hustling was not a metaphor. It was routine. Arrests followed. Time was served. When he returned, music became the exit strategy. Not fantasy. Not image. A disciplined attempt to replace one income with another. The transition was visible and slow. Studio sessions replaced corners. Verses replaced transactions. He spoke from memory, not imagination, and that authenticity carried him forward. Momentum arrived quickly once the door opened. Songs spread. Collaborations followed. Crowds recognized his voice before his face. The success was loud enough to be seen from far away. New money showed itself in familiar symbols. Expensive cars. Packed venues. Movement between boroughs without hesitation. To fans, it looked like victory. To people left behind, it looked like provocation. In environments shaped by scarcity, success does not always inspire. It often irritates. The mistake was believing time had erased old accounts. Prison sentences end on paper, but grudges do not follow calendars. Debts do not dissolve just because someone changes professions. The streets keep their own ledgers. Names remain highlighted long after people believe they have been crossed out. As his profile grew, so did attention from those who remembered him differently. To them, he was not a rapper. He was a man who owed. The night it ended did not begin with chaos. It began with routine. A performance completed. Applause fading. The drive home through Queens felt familiar. The car he was driving symbolized distance from the past. Comfort. Control. That symbol became the target. He stopped at a traffic light. A pause forced by the city. That pause created vulnerability. Another vehicle pulled alongside. Not a coincidence. He had been followed. Watched. Studied. The moment was chosen carefully. When the shots rang out, they came fast. Close. Unmistakable. The intent was clear. This was not intimidation. This was final. The glass shattered. Metal tore. The success that had carried him forward could not shield him in that instant. He was rushed to a hospital. Efforts were made. None succeeded. News spread quickly. The industry reacted with disbelief. Fans reached for explanations that felt safer. Random violence. Mistaken identity. Anything that avoided the deeper truth. But the pattern did not support those ideas. This was targeted. Personal. Rooted in history. For a long time, the case stalled. Rumors replaced facts. Names circulated quietly. Fear kept mouths closed. The city had seen this before. High-profile deaths followed by long silence. But investigators did not let the file go cold. They traced movements. They revisited old conflicts. They listened to whispers that never made headlines. Years later, arrests came. The narrative sharpened. The man identified as the shooter was not a stranger. He was a ghost from the past. Someone who had shared time, space, and resentment. The motive was not artistic rivalry. It was unfinished business. Money once promised. Respect once denied. Success that felt undeserved to those who never escaped. In court, the story lost its mystery and gained its cruelty. Jealousy was admitted. Old grievances were confirmed. The waiting had been deliberate. The tracking had been patient. When the sentence was handed down, it provided legal closure but not emotional resolution. Nothing about the outcome restored what was lost. It simply confirmed what many already knew. His death exposed a hard truth about transformation. Leaving the game does not mean the game leaves you. Reinvention does not erase memory in places where memory is enforced. Music can change a life, but it cannot rewrite how others remember the past. Visibility amplifies everything. Success does not just attract fans. It attracts unfinished stories. The legacy he left behind is complicated. He is remembered as proof that reinvention is possible and as evidence that reinvention is fragile. His catalog carries the sound of someone trying to outrun history while still speaking its language. That tension lives in every track. Ambition and caution. Pride and warning. His story is not about punishment. It is about consequence. Not for lyrics. Not for image. For proximity to a past that refused to stay buried. The streets did not care that he had moved on. They cared that he had moved ahead. In that calculation, progress became an insult. Whether his success made the outcome inevitable or simply visible remains a question listeners still wrestle with. And as this chapter closes, the next story moves back in time to a soul legend whose life was ended not by a deal or a debt, but by the chaos left behind by an entire epidemic. Part 5: King Curtis. King Curtis stood at a peak few musicians ever reach. His sound was instantly recognizable, a saxophone voice that could glide, shout, or mourn without a single word spoken. He had shaped records that defined eras, standing beside legends and lifting songs into history. He led bands, guided sessions, and carried the authority that comes only from mastery. At that moment in his life, there was no comeback narrative, no struggle for relevance. He was already there. Respected. Secure. Accomplished. The city around him was not. New York in the early 70s was unraveling in slow motion. Entire blocks bore the weight of addiction. Heroin moved through neighborhoods like a fog that never lifted. Public spaces blurred into private desperation. Stoops became beds. Sidewalks became waiting rooms. The crisis was not hidden. It was woven into daily life. Sirens were common. Fear was routine. Even success could not purchase distance from it. He lived in a brownstone on a quiet stretch of the Upper West Side, a place that was meant to be a refuge. Home after tours. Home after studios. Home after applause. On a humid summer night, he returned carrying an air conditioner, a small domestic task that felt almost mundane for a man of his stature. The moment mattered because it was ordinary. No entourage. No spotlight. Just a man stepping toward his own front door. Two men were sitting on the stoop. Strangers. Displaced. Deep in the grip of substances that had already stripped away judgment. In that city and in that era, the sight was sadly common. He did not escalate. He did not threaten. He asked them to move. He asked for access to his own home. The request was reasonable. It should have ended there. It did not. The response was defiance fueled by confusion and chemicals. Words turned sharp. Tension rose quickly, not because of intent, but because reason had no anchor. In that moment, addiction distorted reality. A simple request sounded like an attack. Pride collided with impairment. The situation slipped beyond logic. The struggle that followed was brief and chaotic. There was no plan. No calculation. One of the men produced a knife. Not as leverage. As action. The blade struck. The shock was immediate. The greatest saxophonist of his generation staggered backward on his own block, wounded by someone who did not know his name and did not care. The men fled. Panic replaced clarity. Neighbors rushed to help. He attempted to move, to find assistance, to stay upright. He was transported to a hospital where doctors worked quickly, but the damage was severe. He died shortly after arrival. The city lost a voice that had soundtracked joy and resilience. He was gone because of a collision he never sought. The investigation moved swiftly. This was not a mystery built on shadows. Witnesses existed. The act had unfolded in public. The man responsible was identified and arrested. The facts were plain. There was no robbery. No premeditation. No underlying feud. The court examined a single truth. Addiction had erased restraint. A moment of confusion had turned lethal. At trial, the narrative did not try to invent complexity. It did not frame the act as a scheme. It framed it as what it was. A senseless eruption caused by a mind overtaken by dependency. The verdict reflected that reality. Accountability was assigned. A sentence was imposed. Justice followed procedure, but it did not restore balance. The aftermath rippled through the music world. Colleagues mourned openly. Tributes filled venues and airwaves. Yet beneath the grief was a colder realization. This death did not fit the usual stories people tell themselves about risk. He was not involved in the drug trade. He was not navigating street disputes. He was not living recklessly. He was simply present in a city overwhelmed by a crisis it could not contain. His death reframed the danger. It showed that the drug epidemic does not require participation to claim victims. It creates an atmosphere where unpredictability becomes normal. Where ordinary interactions carry invisible risk. Where talent and innocence offer no insulation. The stoop where it happened became symbolic. A threshold meant to separate public chaos from private safety failed to hold. The boundary dissolved. The epidemic crossed it easily. That is the quiet horror of the story. Not that violence happened, but that it required nothing more than proximity. Years later, anger still lingers around the sentence. Some feel it was too light. Others point to the complexity of addiction and responsibility. Those debates continue because the loss feels disproportionate to the cause. A life that brought beauty ended by a moment that brought none. His recordings endure. The saxophone still sings. It still lifts rooms and memories. But the silence left behind remains heavy. His story stands apart from others because it refuses easy blame. There is no rivalry to dissect. No deal to trace. Only a city that failed to protect its people from a tide that swept indiscriminately. This chapter forces a question about how societies measure harm when destruction spreads beyond those who choose risk. And as the series moves forward, the next story turns to a man who stepped into danger trying to stop it, and paid with his life for believing peace was still possible. Part 6: Scott La Rock. Scott La Rock moved through hip-hop differently from the beginning. He was educated. Organized. Purpose-driven. Before stages and studio sessions, he worked as a social worker, spending his days inside shelters and programs designed to stabilize lives already tilted toward collapse. Music was not an escape from responsibility for him. It was an extension of it. He believed sound could redirect energy, that structure could replace chaos, that language could interrupt violence before it hardened into habit. As a producer and organizer, he helped shape a form of rap that insisted on awareness without abandoning realism. He discovered raw talent and built frameworks around it. He paid for sessions. He drove artists to shows. He handled logistics others avoided. In an environment that often rewarded bravado, he valued mediation. In a culture learning how to speak loudly, he believed listening still mattered. The ground he stood on did not share his values. The South Bronx in the late 1980s was defined by fracture. Crack had hollowed out buildings and families. Gangs mapped territory with fear instead of borders. Firearms replaced conversation. Disputes escalated quickly because escalation was the only language many people trusted. In that ecosystem, restraint was often mistaken for weakness. The conflict that pulled him into danger did not begin with him. It began with a younger member of his group caught in a volatile mix of jealousy, drugs, and pride. A disagreement over a woman intersected with the politics of distribution and reputation. Threats followed. Fear followed. A call was made asking for help. Not police help. Personal help. Scott made a choice that reflected who he was. He did not dismiss the call. He did not send someone else. He did not hide behind status. He believed his presence could cool the situation. He believed respect could still function as currency. He got into his vehicle and drove to the housing project where the dispute was unfolding. When he arrived, words were exchanged. Tension loosened. The immediate threat appeared to recede. The conversation did not end in shouting or spectacle. It ended in an agreement to disengage. To leave. To move on. For a brief moment, it seemed like his approach had worked. As he and his group returned to their vehicle, the calculus changed. The decision to retreat was interpreted differently by those watching. In a world governed by optics, turning away can be read as vulnerability. Shots were fired from behind. Not face to face. Not in argument. In ambush. The vehicle was struck. He was hit. Chaos replaced confidence. The drive to the hospital was frantic. He was conscious at first. He spoke. He believed he would recover. The wound did not look fatal. Appearances misled everyone in the room. Complications followed. Internal damage revealed itself too late. Surgeons worked. Time ran out. The man who had come to prevent harm died because harm refused to be reasoned with. He was young. His work was just beginning. The foundation he built suddenly had no architect. The shock rippled through the community. This was not a death that could be explained away as rivalry or excess. He was not involved in the drug trade. He was not carrying a weapon. He was not provoking confrontation. He was trying to stop it. That distinction mattered, and it made the loss harder to absorb. Arrests followed, then collapsed. Witnesses withdrew. Stories shifted. The same code that had allowed violence to flourish now protected those responsible. The case dissolved without resolution. No convictions followed. The absence of accountability became part of the wound. What survived was the response. Grief turned outward. Those closest to him refused to let the death sit quietly. Music became a platform for prevention rather than reflection alone. Artists came together to speak directly to the conditions that had taken him. A movement was born that framed violence not as inevitability but as a choice that could be interrupted. His name became associated with restraint instead of retaliation. With warning instead of revenge. The irony was sharp. He was killed by the very dynamics he had dedicated his life to challenging. Yet that irony fueled action rather than paralysis. His story complicates the myth that staying neutral keeps people safe. It challenges the belief that intelligence alone can outmaneuver chaos. It exposes the risk carried by those who step between armed anger and fragile pride. Mediation requires courage in places where courage is punished. The legacy he left is not confined to records or credits. It lives in the idea that intervention matters even when it fails. That trying to de-escalate has value even when the outcome is tragic. That silence is not the same as peace. In neighborhoods shaped by scarcity and fear, the line between helper and target is thin. He crossed it willingly. He believed that showing up could change outcomes. Sometimes it does. That night, it did not. But the attempt reshaped conversations long after the shots faded. His death marked a turning point. It forced artists to speak about responsibility beyond reputation. It reframed success as something that carries obligation. It asked whether culture can protect its own before the streets decide otherwise. Whether his choice was brave or naive remains a question that still divides listeners. And as this series continues, the next story leaves the Bronx for another city, where a rock singer faced sudden danger in a moment that demanded instinct rather than intention. Part 7. Rhett Forrester. Rhett Forrester was forged in the era when metal demanded size, volume, and defiance. His voice carried weight. His presence filled stages. In the 1980s, he fronted crowds that came for excess and left hoarse from shouting along. Leather, long hair, and raw power were not costumes. They were identity. For a time, that identity translated into protection. Fame created distance. Applause built a wall between performer and street. By the early 1990s, that wall had thinned. The music industry moved on quickly. New sounds replaced old anthems. Stadiums became memories. He was still respected by fans, still admired by those who knew the genre, but celebrity no longer functioned as armor. He was living like a working musician, not a guarded icon. Driving himself. Moving through the city without an entourage. Existing as a recognizable face in places that did not care who he was. Atlanta was not a forgiving city at that time. Crime rates climbed. Crack reshaped entire neighborhoods. Carjacking became common enough to feel routine. Intersections turned into hunting grounds. People learned to keep their heads down, their windows up, their reactions quick. The rules were simple and brutal. Hesitation could cost you everything. The moment arrived without warning. Daylight. Traffic. A pause at an intersection that forced stillness. Two men approached. Not fans. Not curious passers-by. Predators looking for opportunity. Demands were made. The vehicle. Possessions. Compliance. What happened next lasted seconds but defined his story forever. He did not comply. Whether from instinct, pride, or disbelief, he resisted. Years of projecting strength do not switch off easily. A man who built a career on refusing to back down did not suddenly learn submission. He argued. He pushed back. He tried to hold ground that did not exist. The response was immediate. A weapon appeared. No warning shot. No second chance. A single shot struck him from behind. The attackers fled. They did not even take the car. Fear replaced greed. Violence replaced intention. The street moved on as if nothing had happened. He was left bleeding in his seat. Passers-by called for help. Emergency services arrived. Efforts were made. They failed. A voice that once cut through walls was silenced in an ordinary intersection by a moment that demanded surrender instead of resistance. The investigation began the same way many do. Questions. Canvassing. Silence. No witnesses stepped forward. No clear description stuck. In areas shaped by fear, survival often means forgetting what you saw. The case stalled. Leads dried up. The file grew cold. Authorities suspected the truth but could not prove it. Local criminals. Addicts. Men looking for quick gain to feed habits that did not care who suffered. Without testimony, suspicion remained just that. Time passed. Attention faded. Justice never arrived. What lingers is the question his death raises. When faced with sudden threat, is resistance bravery or error? Is survival instinct universal or shaped by identity? For someone whose entire public life was built on defiance, compliance may not have felt possible. That does not make the choice wrong. It makes it human. His death highlights a cruel mismatch. The mindset required to dominate a stage is not the mindset required to survive a street robbery. The qualities that made him compelling as an artist may have made him vulnerable as a civilian. Confidence does not translate to safety when chaos sets the terms. Fans remember him as a powerful vocalist, a symbol of an era when music was loud and unapologetic. The manner of his death complicates that memory. It strips away glamour and replaces it with randomness. It shows how quickly myth collapses when faced with everyday violence. There was no message sent by his killing. No feud settled. No territory claimed. Just loss. A life ended because two paths crossed at the wrong second in a city overwhelmed by crime. His story does not offer closure. It offers reflection. About instinct. About pride. About how quickly the rules change when danger chooses you. And as this chapter ends, the next story travels south to a city where a local rap icon was taken down not by chance, but by a calculated hit rooted deep in street hierarchy. Part 8. Soulja Slim. Soulja Slim was not manufactured by marketing teams or radio rotations. He was shaped by streets that demanded proof before respect. His voice carried the cadence of lived experience, not imitation. Listeners heard hunger, fear, pride, and survival woven into every bar. In New Orleans, he was not treated as a celebrity first. He was treated as real. That status brought loyalty, but it also carried a cost few outsiders understood. The city that raised him operated on its own logic. New Orleans at the turn of the century balanced celebration and danger in the same breath. Music spilled from windows while violence settled disputes quietly. The drug economy funded entire blocks. Silence protected careers and lives. Reputation mattered more than paperwork. In that environment, a certain profession thrived. The hired gun. A figure known by name but never spoken about openly. Someone who handled problems without drama and vanished afterward. Slim knew that world because he had survived it. He spoke openly about addiction and prison without romantic language. He did not pretend he had always been clean or careful. That honesty made him credible. It also meant he carried history that never fully lets go. When success finally arrived, it did not erase memory. It amplified it. By the time his breakthrough felt imminent, his focus had shifted. He was recording. Planning. Collaborating. Momentum built quietly but steadily. The sound that once belonged only to local neighborhoods was reaching farther. Industry attention followed. The timing mattered. This was not a decline story. This was a beginning interrupted. The night it happened was not framed by spectacle. It was not a performance. It was a visit to his mother's home. Familiar ground. A place associated with safety and routine. He stood outside, relaxed enough to believe the past had loosened its grip. That belief lasted seconds. The approach was direct. Not a drive-by. Not confusion. A man walked up and fired at close range. The shots were aimed with purpose. Face. Chest. Final. The choice of location and method removed any ambiguity. This was not chance. This was instruction. The message was delivered where it would hurt most. He collapsed in front of the house where he had grown up. Sirens followed. Neighbors gathered. Grief spread faster than facts. He was pronounced dead soon after. The city felt the loss immediately. A voice that had spoken its truth without filters was gone in an instant. Investigators moved in. Names circulated. One name in particular carried weight. A man already whispered about in connection with other killings. A reputation built on fear and survival. Evidence pointed in his direction. He was arrested. Hope flickered. Then the system faltered. Witnesses withdrew. Statements softened. The same pattern repeated. In a city where testifying could end a life, cooperation was rare. Without voices, cases collapse. Charges were dropped. The suspected shooter walked free. Public frustration grew, but it did not change the outcome. The law could not move without testimony. The streets understood that reality well. Silence had done its job again. Time passed. Music charts moved on. But the city kept score differently. Years later, the man believed to be responsible was killed as well. Found shot on a sidewalk. No witnesses. No arrests. The symmetry felt cruel rather than satisfying. Street justice closed a loop the courts never could. Slim's legacy lives in contradiction. He is remembered as a victim and as a survivor who never stopped speaking honestly. His music gained new weight after his death. Lines once heard as confession now sounded like warning. The cost of authenticity became impossible to ignore. His story exposes how success can sharpen danger instead of dulling it. Visibility does not always protect. In some places, it paints a clearer target. When money and reputation intersect with unresolved history, contracts replace conversations. There was no public motive announced. No document explaining why he was chosen at that moment. That absence feeds debate. Was it envy? Old grudges? Fear of his rise? In cities governed by silence, truth rarely arrives intact. What remains is the image of a man who told his story straight and paid for living long enough to be heard. He did not die because he was careless that night. He died because someone decided his presence was a threat that needed removal. His death marks the difference between random violence and intention. It reminds listeners that some endings are written quietly long before they happen. The trigger is only the last step. How responsibility should be assigned in a city that punishes speech remains an open question many still struggle with. And as this chapter closes, the next story moves to Atlanta, where a childhood bond inside a recording studio unraveled into chaos with consequences no court could fully settle. Part 9. Bankroll Fresh. Bankroll Fresh rose with the city behind him. Atlanta recognized his voice before the rest of the country did. He sounded local in the way that earns trust. Not polished. Not distant. Grounded in the rhythm of neighborhoods that shaped him. Industry attention followed because the streets validated him first. He carried that validation with pride, and he never fully let go of the relationships that came with it. That loyalty blurred lines. Success widened his reach but did not narrow his circle. He moved between studios and streets with the same confidence. For him, the studio was more than a workplace. It was neutral ground. A shared space where creation replaced conflict. Guns were supposed to stay outside. Respect was supposed to keep things calm. That belief held until it didn't. The night that changed everything began without tension. Music played. Conversations overlapped. Familiar faces moved in and out. Then a childhood friend walked in. Someone from the same blocks. The same early years. Paths had split, but history still bound them. The energy shifted quietly. Not dramatic. Just enough to be felt. The disagreement that followed was small. Words exchanged. Egos brushed. Nothing that should have mattered. But pride does not measure scale. In environments where respect is currency, even minor slights can feel expensive. Bankroll made a decision meant to restore order. He asked the men to leave. In his own space, he asserted control. That moment reframed everything. Being told to leave did not land as de-escalation. It landed as humiliation. The friend did not disappear into the night to cool off. He went to his vehicle. He returned armed. The studio's rules dissolved instantly. Bankroll recognized the threat. He armed himself as well. Two men who once shared childhood memories now faced each other through weapons. The shift from argument to confrontation happened faster than anyone could process. Fear mixed with anger. Noise replaced reason. The exchange that followed was chaotic. Shots echoed. Walls shook. Glass shattered. People ran. More than 50 shell casings were later recovered. The studio, meant for sound, became a battlefield. In the confusion, Bankroll was hit. The wound was severe. He collapsed outside, bleeding on the pavement of a place that once felt safe. Emergency services arrived. Efforts were made. He died shortly after. News spread fast. Atlanta reacted with disbelief and anger. The story was difficult to accept because it did not involve strangers. It involved someone who knew him. Someone who shared his past. Investigators reviewed footage. Statements. Trajectories. The shooter admitted involvement but framed it carefully. Self-defense. Mutual combat. A narrative built on the claim that he feared for his life. Prosecutors weighed the evidence. They declined to bring charges. The case was closed without a trial. That decision split opinion sharply. Some accepted the legal logic. Others rejected it outright. How self-defense applies when both sides bring weapons remains a question that still burns. For the family, the ruling felt like abandonment. For fans, it felt like erasure. The men who fired the shots walked free. He spoke publicly afterward. He leaned into notoriety. He framed survival as victory. The absence of legal consequences did not bring peace. It deepened the wound. Bankroll's death exposed how quickly loyalty can turn lethal when pride takes control. It showed that proximity can be more dangerous than rivalry. The person who knows your habits, your timing, your trust points holds power outsiders never will. The studio no longer looks neutral in hindsight. It was a pressure chamber where unresolved history met weapons and ego. Creativity could not compete with fear once the rules collapsed. His legacy sits uncomfortably between success and warning. He proved that local authenticity can build national momentum. He also proved that refusing to separate fully from past dynamics carries risk that fame cannot soften. Nothing about his death feels clean. Not the argument. Not the aftermath. Not the legal outcome. It leaves listeners staring at a space where justice and legality failed to align. Whether the law did enough or simply followed procedure is a question that still divides anyone who studies the case closely. And as this story ends, the final chapter turns to the most infamous killing of all, where power, money, and long memory converged at a red light in Los Angeles. Part 10. The Notorious B.I.G. The Notorious B.I.G. stood at the center of the East Coast with a crown built from language, confidence, and timing. His voice turned street observation into narrative authority. He did not merely rap about power. He embodied it. To the public, his death was framed as the final chapter of a loud rivalry. Lyrics versus lyrics. Coasts versus coasts. That framing was convenient. It simplified grief into spectacle and allowed deeper forces to remain unseen. The months after Tupac's death reshaped the atmosphere of hip-hop. Suspicion filled rooms. Security tightened. Every appearance felt loaded with meaning. Public events carried a nervous edge. Yet the dominant story stayed narrow. A cultural feud. A clash of egos. The idea that words alone could ignite fatal consequences became the explanation people accepted. It distracted from quieter movements happening beneath the noise. Biggie arrived in Los Angeles with mixed purpose. Promotion. Presence. Control of narrative. He attended a major industry party filled with executives, artists, and cameras. The night carried celebration and tension in equal measure. He appeared relaxed. Confident. Dressed sharply. Surrounded by familiar faces. Protection felt sufficient. Familiarity often creates comfort. Comfort can dull caution. When the party ended, the exit spilled onto city streets. A convoy formed. Vehicles rolled forward together. Music played. Conversations continued through open windows. The city lights reflected off glass and paint. At a red light, the line paused. Stillness returned for a brief moment. A dark vehicle pulled alongside. The approach was smooth. Unhurried. The shooter did not shout. Did not gesture. A weapon appeared. Shots were fired through the passenger side. The selection of ammunition and placement suggested intent rather than impulse. The attack lasted seconds. The vehicle sped away. The city absorbed the sound and moved on. He was rushed to a hospital. Doctors worked aggressively. The injuries were catastrophic. He died shortly after arrival. News traveled faster than facts. Shock rippled through music and media. Tributes began immediately. So did theories. Corruption. Cover-ups. Industry plots. The louder the speculation became, the easier it was to avoid the most uncomfortable possibility. For years, the investigation stalled. Leads surfaced and disappeared. Lawsuits replaced indictments. Rumors hardened into belief. The idea that his death was too complex to solve took root. Complexity became an excuse for inaction. The rap feud narrative stayed dominant because it was familiar and dramatic. Recent developments shifted that picture. Testimony and admissions reframed the event as a targeted hit connected to organized crime. Not poetic rivalry. Not spontaneous retaliation. A transaction. Allegedly arranged and financed within a network built on drug trafficking. The motive moved away from art and toward economics. According to this account, the shooter was not acting out of personal insult. He was fulfilling a role. The operation displayed coordination. Surveillance. Escape planning. Professional calm. These are not hallmarks of impulsive anger. They suggest preparation. The rivalry narrative functioned as camouflage, drawing attention away from financial disputes and criminal alliances. This reframing alters how responsibility is understood. It suggests that Biggie did not die because of what he said. He died because of where power and money intersected with unresolved street business. His visibility made him valuable. His presence created leverage. In that calculation, art was irrelevant. The arrest years later of a figure tied to the alleged planning brought renewed attention. Not closure. Attention. The delay itself speaks to the environment surrounding the case. Fear. Loyalty. Silence. The same forces seen throughout this series appear again. Organized structures outlasting individual lives. Truth arriving slowly, fragmented by time. His legacy remains intact musically, but morally complicated. He is celebrated as a storyteller who captured ambition and consequence in equal measure. The revelation that his death may have been purchased rather than provoked forces listeners to separate myth from mechanism. It challenges the romantic idea that art alone determines fate. The phrase rap beef now sounds insufficient. It reduces a complex web to a headline. The evidence points toward a different conclusion. He was caught between worlds that used culture as cover and money as motive. The red light was not coincidence. It was opportunity. His catalog continues to play. Lines once heard as bravado now feel prophetic. He warned about rules he did not control. He described systems that devour their own. In the end, he became part of the lesson he narrated. He did not fall because of competition on charts or insults in verses. He fell because criminal economies do not respect fame. They respect payment. In that economy, celebrity can become a liability rather than protection. Whether justice delayed can still be justice remains a question many listeners wrestle with as new details emerge. And as the final echoes of this case settle, the stories just told invite a broader reckoning with how music, money, and violence intertwine beyond what headlines ever admit.